The amber glow of Murphy's Tavern cast long shadows across weathered oak tables, where the scent of aged whiskey mingled with the quiet murmur of evening conversation. In the heart of Cambridge, Massachusetts, this unremarkable pub had witnessed countless debates between Harvard professors, but tonight would host something far more extraordinary. Martin Heidegger sat alone at a corner table, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of German beer, steam rising from his pipe as he contemplated the evening's solitude. The 70-year-old philosopher had come to America reluctantly, invited for a series of lectures that he found himself questioning with each passing day. His deep-set eyes reflected a weariness that came not from travel, but from decades of wrestling with questions that most people never bothered to ask. The tavern door opened with a gentle chime, and Bertrand Russell stepped inside, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. At 78, the British philosopher moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his mind remained as sharp as the wit that had made him famous across 2 continents. He scanned the room with those penetrating blue eyes, seeking a quiet corner where he might escape the tedium of academic social functions. Their eyes met across the dimly lit space, 2 giants of 20th-century thought, each recognizing the other despite their vastly different approaches to understanding human existence. Russell hesitated for a moment, then approached Heidegger's table with the kind of curiosity that had driven his entire intellectual life. "Professor Heidegger," Russell said, his crisp English accent cutting through the tavern's ambient noise, "I must say, I didn't expect to find you in such a place." Heidegger looked up, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Herr Russell, perhaps we both seek refuge from the same academic pretensions." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, join me. The evening is too long for solitary contemplation." Russell settled into the worn leather chair, ordering a gin and tonic from the passing waitress. The 2 men sat in momentary silence, each taking the measure of the other. They had never met in person, though their work had circled each other like distant planets for decades. You know," Russell began, swirling the ice in his drink, "I've been reading your recent essays on technology and dwelling. Curious stuff, though I confess I find myself skeptical of your fundamental premises." Heidegger chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting in his throat. "Skepticism is your profession, is it not? Though I wonder if your skepticism extends to skepticism itself." "Touché," Russell replied, raising his glass. "Though I'd argue that doubt, properly applied, is the most reliable tool we have for approaching truth. Your work seems to suggest we need something more metaphysical." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Heidegger leaned back in his chair, studying Russell with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to understand what it meant to be human in an increasingly complex world. "Metaphysical," Heidegger repeated slowly. "You speak as if it was some optional accessory to human existence, like a pocket watch or walking stick. But tell me, Russell, when you wake in the morning and feel that fundamental anxiety about your place in the world, do you dismiss that as mere neurochemistry?" Russell's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm not sure I experience quite the existential dread you seem to find so central to human experience. Most mornings I wake up thinking about logic problems or wondering whether my breakfast will agree with me." "Ah, but that is precisely my point," Heidegger said, leaning forward. "You have trained yourself to flee from the fundamental questions that make us human. You retreat into logic and mathematics because they provide the illusion of certainty." The conversation was already taking on the character that would define their evening, a gentle but persistent probing of each other's most basic assumptions about reality, knowledge, and human nature. Around them, the tavern continued its quiet evening rhythm, but their table had become an island of intense philosophical engagement. Russell took a sip of his drink, considering his response carefully. "I wouldn't call it fleeing, Martin. I'd call it intellectual honesty. When I examine these grand metaphysical questions you're so fond of, I find that most of them dissolve under careful analysis, their linguistic puzzles masquerading as deep insights. And yet," Heidegger replied, his voice growing more animated, "you cannot escape the fact that you are asking these questions at all. The very capacity for skepticism presupposes something that transcends mere empirical observation. You are not just a biological machine processing data. You are a being who wonders about being itself." The stage was set for a debate that would stretch deep into the night, 2 brilliant minds approaching the most fundamental question of human existence from entirely different directions. Russell with his commitment to logical rigor and empirical observation, and Heidegger with his conviction that human existence could only be understood through careful attention to our deepest experiences of being in the world. The tavern had grown quieter as the evening progressed, with most of the dinner crowd having departed for home. Russell and Heidegger remained at their corner table, their conversation deepening like wine aging in oak barrels. The waitress had brought them another round without being asked, sensing that these two elderly gentlemen were engaged in something far more significant than casual conversation. "Let me pose this differently," Russell said, adjusting his spectacles as he leaned across the table. "You speak of fundamental questions about being as if they were unavoidable features of human consciousness, but I would argue that most people live perfectly fulfilling lives without ever concerning themselves with metaphysical speculation. My grocer certainly doesn't spend his evenings wondering about the nature of existence." Heidegger smiled, drawing slowly on his pipe. "Your grocer Russell is perhaps more philosophical than you realize. When he stands before his shelves in the morning, arranging his goods, he is engaged in a fundamental act of world-making. He understands, without articulating it, that human beings dwell in meaning, not just in space and time." "That strikes me as rather romantic projection," Russell replied. "When my grocer arranges his shelves, he's following established patterns that maximize sales and efficiency. There's no mysterious metaphysical dimension to it, just practical intelligence applied to a concrete problem." "But you miss the essential point," Heidegger said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone trying to explain color to the blind. "The grocer's ability to see efficiency and sales already presupposes a whole framework of meaning that cannot be reduced to mere physical processes. He inhabits a world where things matter, where some arrangements are better than others, where human purposes shape reality itself." Russell frowned, swirling the remains of his gin and tonic. "I'll grant you that human consciousness involves complex pattern recognition and goal-seeking behavior, but why invoke metaphysics to explain what cognitive science and economics can handle perfectly well?" "Because," Heidegger replied, leaning forward with sudden intensity, "your cognitive science and economics are themselves metaphysical positions. They assume that reality consists fundamentally of objects manipulating other objects according to natural laws. They treat consciousness as if it were just another object to be studied, rather than the very condition that makes study possible." The conversation was touching on something that had divided philosophy for centuries: the relationship between scientific explanation and human experience. Russell represented the tradition that saw science as gradually replacing metaphysical speculation with precise knowledge, while Heidegger insisted that science itself rested on unexamined metaphysical assumptions. "You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be," Russell said, though his tone remained friendly. "When I apply logical analysis to a problem, I can verify my results through observation and testing. When you engage in metaphysical speculation about the meaning of being, what possible verification could there be?" Heidegger chuckled. "Verification? You speak as if truth were a commodity to be purchased at the marketplace of empirical testing. But tell me, Russell, how do you verify the assumption that only verifiable statements are meaningful? That claim itself cannot be tested empirically." Russell paused, recognizing the challenge. It was the kind of recursive problem that had haunted logical positivism for decades: the difficulty of applying scientific standards to the philosophical foundations of science itself. "Perhaps," Russell conceded, "but at least scientific method produces results. It enables prediction and control. It builds bridges and cures diseases. What has metaphysics ever accomplished besides endless debate?" "Ah," Heidegger said, his eyes lighting up. "Now we approach the heart of the matter. You measure the worth of thinking by its capacity to manipulate and control. But what if this instrumental approach to truth is precisely what alienates us from our own humanity?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Heidegger's pipe. Russell found himself confronting an uncomfortable possibility: that his entire intellectual project might rest on assumptions about human flourishing that he had never seriously examined. "I'm not sure I follow," Russell said slowly. "How can knowledge that improves human welfare be alienating?" "Because," Heidegger replied, "when we approach everything, including ourselves, as objects to be manipulated and controlled, we lose touch with the wonder and mystery that make us human in the first place. We become so busy managing existence that we forget to live it." Russell drummed his fingers thoughtfully against his glass, the amber liquid catching the tavern's warm light. Around them, the evening crowd had thinned to a handful of regulars, nursing their drinks in comfortable solitude. The two philosophers had found themselves in increasingly familiar territory: the ancient tension between reason and experience, between clarity and depth. You paint a rather dire picture of rational thought, Russell said finally. But surely you don't mean to suggest that careful reasoning is somehow dehumanizing. Logic has liberated us from superstition, prejudice, and countless forms of muddled thinking. Heidegger nodded slowly. I do not disparage logic, Russell. What concerns me is the assumption that logical analysis can capture the full richness of human existence. When you reduce thinking to the manipulation of symbols according to formal rules, you miss something essential about what it means to be a thinking being. And what exactly do I miss? Russell asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. You miss the fact that thinking is always already embedded in a world of significance that cannot be formalized, Heidegger replied. When you construct your logical systems, you presuppose meanings that the system itself cannot generate. The very words we use, truth, validity, proof, carry a weight of understanding that no formal definition can fully capture. Russell felt a familiar frustration rising. Throughout his career, he had encountered this kind of objection from philosophers who seemed to prefer mystery to clarity. But surely precise definition is preferable to vague intuition. When we formalize our concepts, we can examine them critically, test them against experience, build upon them systematically. Precise, yes, Heidegger agreed, but also bloodless. Your formal systems achieve their precision by draining away everything that makes human existence meaningful. They are like perfect maps that capture every geographical detail while missing the lived experience of walking through a landscape. The analogy struck Russell as apt, though not in the way Heidegger intended. Maps are enormously useful precisely because they abstract from the confusion of immediate experience. They allow us to navigate, to plan, to understand spatial relationships that would be invisible from ground level. True, Heidegger conceded, but you cannot live on a map. You cannot find shelter in a geometric description of a house or be nourished by a chemical analysis of bread. There is always a gap between abstract knowledge and concrete existence, a gap that metaphysics attempts to bridge. Russell leaned back in his chair, considering. I'm beginning to see our fundamental disagreement more clearly. You seem to think that abstract analysis necessarily impoverishes our understanding of human experience. I would argue the opposite, that careful analysis enriches our understanding by revealing hidden assumptions and clarifying confused concepts. But at what cost? Heidegger asked. When you analyze the concept of love, for instance, breaking it down into neurochemical processes and behavioral patterns, do you really understand love better, or have you simply changed the subject entirely? The question touched something uncomfortable in Russell's mind. He had spent decades developing increasingly sophisticated logical tools for analyzing philosophical problems, but he sometimes wondered whether his technical apparatus had become an end in itself, disconnected from the human concerns that had originally motivated his philosophical investigations. Perhaps, Russell said carefully, analysis and lived experience serve different purposes. I don't turn to logic for guidance in my personal relationships, but I do rely on it when I'm trying to understand the foundations of mathematics or the structure of language. Exactly my point, Heidegger said, leaning forward with renewed energy. You have divided human existence into separate domains, the logical and the existential, the scientific and the personal, but this division is itself a metaphysical choice and not a particularly healthy one. Russell frowned. How so? Because it assumes that rational analysis can be perfectly objective, uncontaminated by the particular perspective of the analyst. But you are not a disembodied intellect, Russell. You are a human being shaped by your historical moment, your cultural background, your personal anxieties and hopes. Your logic is no more universal than my poetry. The comment stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Russell had always prided himself on his intellectual objectivity, his ability to rise above personal prejudice and cultural limitation. But recent developments in logic and mathematics had begun to suggest that even the most formal systems contained hidden assumptions about meaning and truth. If you're right, Russell said slowly, then philosophy becomes impossible. How can we make any progress in understanding if everything is simply a matter of cultural perspective? Heidegger smiled. Not impossible, just more honest about its own limitations. Instead of pretending to speak from nowhere, we acknowledge that all thinking emerges from somewhere, from the concrete situation of finite beings trying to make sense of their existence. The conversation had reached a natural pause, both men lost in their own thoughts, as the tavern's atmosphere grew more intimate with the deepening night. Russell found himself studying Heidegger's weathered face, trying to understand how someone could build an entire philosophy around what seemed to him like romantic mystification. Yet there was something compelling about the German's earnestness, his conviction that philosophy should address the deepest human concerns rather than retreat into technical puzzles. "Let me try a different approach," Russell said, breaking the contemplative silence. "You speak eloquently about wonder and mystery, about the richness of lived experience. But it seems to me that wonder is precisely what drives scientific inquiry. When a physicist marvels at the elegance of quantum mechanics, or a mathematician discovers an unexpected proof, aren't they experiencing exactly the kind of engagement with reality you claim logic destroys?" Heidegger considered this carefully, drawing on his pipe as he gathered his thoughts. "There is truth in what you say, Russell. Scientific wonder can indeed open us to aspects of reality that would otherwise remain hidden. But I worry about what happens when wonder becomes merely instrumental, when we wonder only in order to control, to predict, to manipulate." "But what's wrong with control and prediction?" Russell asked. "Surely it's better to understand how diseases spread so we can prevent them, or how bridges bear weight so we can build them safely." "Nothing is wrong with such knowledge," Heidegger replied. "My concern is that this instrumental approach gradually colonizes all human thinking. We begin to treat ourselves and others as problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be lived. We lose the capacity for what I call meditative thinking, a way of engaging with the world that doesn't immediately seek to master it." Russell shifted in his seat, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of their conversation. "This meditative thinking you describe sounds suspiciously like passive resignation. How does it differ from simple indolence?" Heidegger's eyes flashed with something between amusement and irritation. "Passive? Russell, have you ever tried to truly listen to another person? Not to analyze their words or formulate your response, but simply to receive what they are offering. It requires tremendous discipline and attention." "I listen to people all the time," Russell protested. "Do you? Or do you listen for logical fallacies, empirical errors, opportunities to advance your own position? When you encounter ideas that don't fit your conceptual framework, do you work to understand them on their own terms, or do you translate them into familiar categories?" The question hit home more forcefully than Russell cared to admit. He had spent the evening doing exactly what Heidegger described, trying to fit the German's ideas into his own philosophical vocabulary rather than genuinely engaging with them as invitations to think differently. "Perhaps," Russell said slowly, "but surely critical evaluation is part of genuine intellectual engagement. If I simply accepted everything you said without question, we wouldn't be having a real conversation at all." "True," Heidegger agreed, "but there is a difference between critical engagement and defensive dismissal. The deepest thinking requires a willingness to be changed by what we encounter, to allow our fundamental assumptions to be questioned." Russell found himself in the curious position of recognizing the truth in Heidegger's words, while simultaneously resisting their implications. His entire intellectual career had been built on the conviction that clear thinking could gradually eliminate confusion and error from human discourse. The possibility that clarity itself might be a form of blindness was deeply unsettling. "You're asking me to embrace contradiction," Russell said, "to affirm both rational analysis and something beyond reason simultaneously." "Not beyond reason," Heidegger corrected, "but prior to the narrow conception of reason that has dominated Western thought since Descartes. There are ways of thinking that are neither irrational nor reducible to formal logic, ways of engaging with the world that respect both intellectual rigor and existential depth." "And how exactly would one cultivate such thinking?" Russell asked, his tone mixing genuine curiosity with lingering skepticism. Heidegger leaned back, a slight smile playing across his features. "Perhaps by sitting in taverns with old adversaries, allowing our certainties to be questioned, discovering that our deepest disagreements might point toward truths neither of us could reach alone." The comment hung in the air between them, an implicit acknowledgement that their debate had become something more than intellectual exercise. Despite their fundamental disagreements, or perhaps because of them, they were engaged in the kind of thinking Heidegger had been describing: open, exploratory, transformative. Russell felt a strange mixture of frustration and gratitude. Frustration because Heidegger consistently refused to engage on purely logical terms, and gratitude because this refusal had opened spaces for reflection that pure logic might never have revealed. As the evening wore on, the tavern had grown quieter still, with only the soft clatter of glasses and the occasional murmur of conversation from the bar, to break the intensity of their dialogue. Russell had ordered another gin and tonic, while Heidegger nursed his second beer with the careful deliberation of someone who treated even drinking as a form of contemplation. "There's something I've been wondering about your position," Russell said, returning to their central theme with renewed focus. "You criticize what you call instrumental thinking, but you're using language, arguably the most powerful tool humans have ever developed, to make your argument. Doesn't this involve you in exactly the kind of technological manipulation you claim to reject?" Heidegger's eyes brightened at the challenge. "An astute observation, Russell. Language indeed shapes and constrains what we can think. But there is a crucial difference between using language as a mere tool for communication and allowing language to speak through us as a revelation of being itself." "I'm not sure I follow that distinction," Russell replied. "Language is a conventional system of symbols with agreed-upon meanings. When we use it effectively, we convey information clearly and persuasively. How can it be anything more than a tool? Because," Heidegger said, leaning forward with sudden intensity, "language is not something we possess, but something that possesses us. We do not simply use words, we are constituted by them. The very concepts through which you understand yourself and your world come to you through language that you did not create." Russell frowned. "Surely you're overstating the case. I can define my terms precisely, construct new concepts when existing ones prove inadequate, even create entirely artificial languages for specific purposes. Language may influence thought, but it doesn't determine it completely." "Can you?" Heidegger asked. "When you create what you call artificial languages, are you not still working within inherited assumptions about meaning, reference, and truth? Your logical systems may appear purely formal, but they carry hidden metaphysical commitments that you cannot simply engineer away." The point struck Russell as both fascinating and troubling. His work in mathematical logic had indeed been motivated by the hope of creating perfectly precise languages that would eliminate the ambiguities and confusions of ordinary discourse. But Heidegger seemed to be suggesting that this project was doomed from the start, that any language, no matter how formal, would inevitably embed particular ways of understanding reality. "Even if I grant your point about language," Russell said, "I don't see how it supports your broader argument about metaphysics. Couldn't we simply acknowledge that all human thinking is historically and linguistically conditioned without concluding that we need some kind of mystical insight into being?" Heidegger chuckled. "Mystical insight? Russell, you persist in misunderstanding my position. I am not advocating for some kind of supernatural revelation. I am simply trying to take seriously the implications of what you yourself have just acknowledged, that human thinking is always already embedded in historical and linguistic frameworks that cannot be fully objectified. But taking something seriously doesn't require treating it as metaphysically ultimate," Russell countered. "We can study the history and sociology of knowledge without concluding that objective truth is impossible." "Objective truth," Heidegger repeated thoughtfully. "There is that word again, objective. As if truth were somehow independent of the beings who encounter it, as if it existed in some realm apart from human understanding and care." Russell felt his patience beginning to fray. "Without some notion of objective truth, how can we distinguish between accurate and inaccurate beliefs? How can we say that one scientific theory is better than another, or that one moral judgment is more justified than its alternatives?" "I do not reject the possibility of better and worse," Heidegger replied calmly, "but I question whether these distinctions can be grounded in correspondence to some supposedly mind-independent reality. Perhaps truth is better understood as a kind of unconcealment, a way of allowing things to show themselves as they are within the horizons of human understanding." "That sounds like relativism to me," Russell said bluntly. "If truth is always relative to human frameworks of understanding, then anything goes. We lose the ability to make rational arguments or scientific progress." Heidegger shook his head. "Not relativism, finitude. The recognition that human beings are finite creatures whose understanding is always partial and perspectival does not eliminate the possibility of truth. It simply locates truth within the concrete historical situation of beings who care about truth." Russell found himself caught between intellectual honesty and deep philosophical resistance. Heidegger's position had a certain coherence, but accepting it would require abandoning commitments that had guided his entire intellectual life. The conversation was forcing him to confront questions he had spent decades trying to avoid, questions about the foundations of logic, the nature of objectivity, and the relationship between human finitude and philosophical truth. The intensity of their philosophical exchange had created an almost hypnotic atmosphere at their corner table. Both men had fallen into a rhythm of careful listening and thoughtful response that transcended their initial disagreements. Russell found himself genuinely grappling with ideas that challenged his most basic assumptions, while Heidegger seemed energized by Russell's persistent logical challenges to his position. "There's something deeply unsettling about what you're suggesting," Russell said finally, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. "If you're right about the limitations of objective reason, then most of my life's work has been built on illusion. The logical systems I've developed, the mathematical foundations I've helped establish, all of it rests on assumptions I can't fully justify." Heidegger's expression softened with something approaching compassion. "Russell, do you think I find it easy to live with uncertainty? Do you imagine that questioning the foundations of Western thought brings me comfort? There is tremendous courage required to acknowledge the groundlessness of our existence, to admit that our deepest certainties might be historical accidents rather than eternal truths. But how do you live with such uncertainty?" Russell asked. "How do you make decisions, take positions, engage in the practical business of existence if everything is open to fundamental questioning?" "Perhaps," Heidegger suggested, "the question itself reveals our problem. You assume that uncertainty paralyzes action, that doubt leads inevitably to despair. But what if the opposite were true? What if acknowledging our finitude opened possibilities for more authentic engagement with the world?" Russell struggled to understand what authentic engagement could mean without some foundation in objective truth. "I'm not sure what you mean by authenticity. Without rational criteria for judgment, how do we distinguish between authentic and inauthentic choices?" Heidegger drew thoughtfully on his pipe before responding. "Authenticity is not a matter of following universal rules or achieving objective certainty. It involves taking responsibility for our choices, while acknowledging that we must choose without ultimate justification. It means embracing our thrownness into existence, without demanding guarantees about the meaning or purpose of that existence." "That sounds terrifying," Russell admitted. "It is terrifying," Heidegger agreed, "but it is also liberating. When we stop demanding certainty from existence, we can begin to appreciate the miracle that anything exists at all, that conscious beings like ourselves have emerged from the universe with the capacity to wonder about existence itself." Russell found himself moved by something in Heidegger's tone, a combination of intellectual honesty and existential courage that he hadn't expected from someone whose philosophy had always struck him as needlessly obscure. Perhaps there was something to be said for approaching philosophical questions with wonder rather than the desire for mastery. "I still don't see how wonder and mystery can substitute for logical analysis," Russell said, though his tone had lost much of its earlier combativeness. "When I'm working on a mathematical proof, I need precision and rigor, not mystical insight." "Of course," Heidegger replied. "Mathematical thinking has its own integrity and value. My point is not that we should abandon logic or mathematics, but that we should recognize their limitations. They are powerful tools for certain purposes, but they cannot address the fundamental questions of human existence." "And what are those fundamental questions?" Russell asked. Heidegger paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Why is there something rather than nothing? What does it mean to be a finite being confronting the possibility of death? How should we understand our responsibility to each other and to the world we share?" These are not questions that can be resolved through logical analysis, but they are also not optional. They shape everything we do, whether we acknowledge them or not. Russell felt a strange mixture of recognition and resistance. Throughout his life, he had indeed been motivated by concerns that transcended purely technical philosophical problems, concerns about human welfare, social justice, and the possibility of rational progress. Perhaps his commitment to logical rigor had been a way of avoiding rather than addressing these deeper questions. "You're suggesting that my entire approach to philosophy has been a form of avoidance," Russell said slowly. "Not avoidance," Heidegger corrected gently, "perhaps preparation. The discipline you have developed through logical analysis, the clarity of thought you have achieved, these are valuable accomplishments. But they might serve as a foundation for deeper questioning rather than an end in themselves." The comment hung in the air between them, suggesting possibilities that Russell had never seriously considered. What if logical rigor and existential depth were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of genuine philosophical thinking? The tavern had grown quiet around them, with only the distant sound of closing time preparations to mark the passage of time. Russell and Heidegger sat in comfortable contemplation, their earlier adversarial dynamic having evolved into something resembling mutual recognition. They had not resolved their fundamental disagreements, but they had discovered that their different approaches to philosophy might illuminate aspects of human existence that neither could reach alone. "I find myself thinking about my childhood," Russell said unexpectedly, his voice carrying a note of wistful reflection. "Before I learned to analyze everything, there were moments of simple amazement, watching clouds form patterns in the sky, wondering why mathematics seemed to reveal hidden harmonies in nature. I suppose I became a philosopher because I wanted to understand those experiences." Heidegger nodded slowly. "And in seeking to understand them, did you manage to preserve what made them amazing in the first place?" Russell considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure. Sometimes I feel that my analytical training has given me powerful tools for understanding the world, but at the cost of a certain immediacy of experience. I can explain why sunsets appear beautiful in terms of optical principles and evolutionary psychology, but I'm not sure I can still simply enjoy a sunset." "Perhaps," Heidegger suggested, "the choice between understanding and experience is a false one. What if genuine understanding actually deepened rather than destroyed our capacity for wonder?" "How so?" Russell asked. "Consider your mathematical work," Heidegger replied. "When you discover an elegant proof or recognize an unexpected connection between different areas of mathematics, is that experience purely analytical, or does it involve something like aesthetic appreciation, a sense of beauty and rightness that cannot be reduced to logical manipulation?" Russell found himself smiling at the observation. "You're right. Some of my most satisfying mathematical experiences have had an almost artistic quality. There's something beautiful about a well-constructed proof that goes beyond its purely logical function." "Exactly," Heidegger said with satisfaction. "Mathematical thinking at its best is not merely instrumental, but revelatory. It opens our eyes to patterns and relationships that would otherwise remain hidden. It is a form of poetry written in the language of number and symbol." "But if that's true," Russell said, following the implications of Heidegger's argument, "then perhaps the opposition between scientific and humanistic approaches to understanding is also false. Maybe rigorous analysis and existential reflection can inform each other." Heidegger leaned back in his chair, a look of quiet satisfaction crossing his features. "Now you begin to understand what I mean by thinking. Not the mere manipulation of concepts according to predetermined rules, but the patient exploration of questions that matter, questions that resist easy answers but reward careful attention." Russell felt something shifting in his understanding, not just of Heidegger's philosophy but of his own philosophical motivations. Perhaps his commitment to logical rigor need not isolate him from the broader human concerns that had originally drawn him to philosophy. Perhaps precision and wonder could coexist. "I'm still not convinced that we need metaphysics to address these questions," Russell said, though his tone was more exploratory than combative. "Couldn't we simply acknowledge the complexity and mystery of human existence without making grand claims about the nature of being itself?" "Perhaps," Heidegger conceded, "but I suspect that any serious engagement with human existence will eventually raise metaphysical questions whether we call them that or not. When you ask about the relationship between mind and world, or wonder about the foundations of logical truth, you are already thinking metaphysically." Russell found himself nodding slowly. "So you're saying that the choice is not whether to engage in metaphysical thinking, but whether to do so explicitly and carefully." "Something like that," Heidegger agreed. "We are metaphysical beings whether we admit it or not. The question is whether we take responsibility for our metaphysical commitments or allow them to operate unconsciously." As their conversation drew toward its natural conclusion, both men seemed aware that something significant had transpired between them. They had not convinced each other to abandon their fundamental philosophical positions, but they had discovered that those positions might be more complementary than contradictory. Russell's commitment to logical precision and Heidegger's attention to existential depth both seemed necessary for any adequate understanding of human existence. "Perhaps," Russell said as they prepared to leave, "the question is not whether humans can live without metaphysics, but whether they can live without the kind of deep questioning that makes us human in the first place." Heidegger smiled as he stood to leave. "And perhaps that questioning is itself the answer, not a solution to be achieved, but a way of being to be cultivated." They parted that evening with mutual respect, their debate having revealed not the triumph of one philosophical approach over another, but the possibility that genuine thinking requires both logical rigor and existential courage. both the precision of analysis and the depth of wonder that makes analysis worthwhile. In the end, the question of whether humans can live without metaphysics had become a question about what kind of beings humans aspire to be.